Well, hello everybody. My name is Anette, and I come from Copenhagen. Did you know that in 1993, Copenhagen was bankrupt? I'm sure this comes as a very, very big surprise to all of you. It did actually to me when I found out. And this is not the picture we see of Copenhagen today. Today, Copenhagen is known as one of the most livable, thriving cities in the world, one of the most sustainable cities in the world, and the city of the happiest people. But this was not actually the case back in the 90s. In the 90s, the city was dominated by old workers' quarters with small flats, lack of basic amenities, bad heating, only maybe shared toilets. And this was the picture of the city at that time. The city then took some really, really bold decisions to transform this picture. And the reason why this was done was because the state took over the administration of the city, because it was de facto bankrupt. So the state and the city together decided to implement some new measures, some rather bold measures, to turn this picture around. And what they did was that they took all of the development rights to the city, all of the land, which actually did belong to Copenhagen, and they put it in a separate company, a company that was then given as its base mission to create sound and sustainable infrastructure in Copenhagen. And so they were selling off the building rights to build the metro, to build the bike lanes, to build all of the infrastructure which is characterizing the sustainable city of Copenhagen today. A whole regeneration effort was also undertaken, and a lot of the smaller flats of the old workers' quarters were joined together to create bigger units to attract a more affluent audience to the city that could pay higher taxes and help the city regain its economic growth. There are many different reasons for this was able to happen. And one of them was a very stable political system in Copenhagen from 1998. But it was actually also very close cooperation between the state and the city. And interestingly enough, the state was run by the conservatives and the city was run by the social democrats. And they actually decided to put all politics aside to save the capital of Denmark. Pretty interesting move with today's politics. This actually means that the city today is very sustainable. 98% of the population in Copenhagen use district heating. We have these amazing harbor swimming pools where people can swim in the harbor water. A lot of good decisions taken, and in close cooperation with the private sector. Public-private cooperation has been very dominant in rebuilding the city of Copenhagen. But most of all, decisions taken by people, for people. So let me give you another example of a very sustainable city and a very smart city. And this is Singapore. But like Copenhagen, it's really interesting that in the 1950s, Singapore was a dump. There were huge informal communities, bad housing, no heating, no employment, a lot of pollution. And one very bold man, Lee Kuan Yew, who's the first Singapore president after they gained independence from Malaysia, took some really bold decisions to transform this. Today, like Copenhagen, we know Singapore as a very thriving and sustainable community. It's a smart nation. They have all these really interesting artificial intelligence projects. They have a project on driverless vehicles. And actually, MIT came out with a study some years ago that said that if Singapore implemented driverless vehicles all over the city, they could reduce their car pool by 2/3, from 900,000 cars to around 300,000 cars. And that is really interesting because that not only helps the environment, but also gives life quality to people because you don't have to sit in queues and it frees up space. Think about all these parking spaces that can then be used for other interesting purposes like housing or regenerational facilities. Singapore also has one of the most interesting approaches to affordable housing that I've seen in my time with IFHP. And did you know that 80% of the people in Singapore live in social housing? It's quite a lot of number of people. And it's all controlled by the Housing Development Board. And the way they do this is that they make you save up your money. 30% of everything you own have to go into an account. You can use some for education, you can use some for medical expenses, and the rest you can use for housing. So when you've gained enough money, you can buy your first flat. Then when you get a family and you earn more money, you can buy a bigger and bigger flat. When you get older, you can trade down again, all controlled by the state. If you get unemployed, they'll help you get a new job. If not, they'll help you sell your flat so you can still afford the flat that you're living in. For a Dane living in a very democratic system, this may be a little intimidating, but it actually means that 80% of the people have stable housing in a city-state like Singapore. So why is all of this important? Well, as Adam has already shared with you, urbanization is hitting us hard. By 2050, 70% of the world's population will live in cities. And this is already happening. In 2006, we passed the 50-50 benchmark, where more than 50% of the people live in cities. More than 3 million people move into cities every week. More than 1,000 people move into Copenhagen every month, which might not sound of many, but for a small city like Copenhagen, this has an enormous impact. So urbanization is already happening in Europe. We know that, and in the Western world, in the US. But where this is going to happen dramatically is in the developing world. It's in the global south. And this is where we really have to be conscious about doing all the good things and taking all the lessons that we have learned throughout the last 50 years of urbanization in the Western world and not repeat the mistakes when urbanizing the developing world. Well, the good news is that the world now has a common agenda for sustainability. So in 2015, all the member states of the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure many of you have already seen and are acquainted with. What is interesting here is that the Sustainable Development Goals followed what was called the Millennium Goals. And the Millennium Goals were adopted in 2000, mainly to take care of global poverty in the developing world. So the people from the global north and the money from the global north help the people from the global south to fight poverty, to make more equal rights for women, and better safety and rights for children. And it was a huge success. In 2015, the goals were actually accomplished. But what we learned throughout these 15 years was that we need to focus on the whole world. That this is not actually a global south program or problem. This is a problem for all of us. All of us in the developing world have to take our share of the responsibility and contribute to getting a more sustainable world for the future. So what can we conclude from this? Well, we can conclude that we have cities like Copenhagen and Singapore that are very smart. They use technology to enable a more sustainable urbanization. They prosper. The city are full of tourists. It's good for Danish businesses. The city is smart. But is this actually also good for the people? And that's a great question to ask. Because in Copenhagen, for example, one of the downsides of the huge success is that the city is now gentrified, which means that it's not very easy to buy anything affordable in Copenhagen anymore. The old quarters, or workers' quarters, have been regenerated and prices are skyrocketing. So the unintended consequence of huge urbanization success is actually now a huge affordable housing crisis. If you earn less than 150,000 euros per year as a family, you have to live more than 40 kilometers outside Copenhagen. And this might not seem far in a big country, but for Denmark, this is a long way. It's far away to commute. And the people that do this commute are the people that service the city. So those are the teachers, the nurses, the policemen that need to be in the city every day. But they need to commute, and this is not good for the environment, but it's also not good for the people, because they use valuable time that they could have spent with their families, or their fly fishing hobbies, or whatever they want to use their time for, instead of sitting in a car. And tourism is actually also becoming slightly burdensome to Denmark and Copenhagen due to services like Airbnb, which were fantastic sharing platforms, but now also means that a lot of affordable housing is bought up by investors and used for tourism instead of for the people that actually should live in these houses. Maybe the time has come again to be bold and look at something completely different for the city of Copenhagen. And for Singapore, for example, do you think all the people are happy with having the state dictating where you live and how you live? These are questions to ask. At IFHP, we have decided to do something about this. And our new Social Cities program actually deals with exactly this problem. We are trying to achieve a better balance of sustainability in cities. So sustainability in our world is three-legged. It's environmental, it's economic, and it's social. And we actually believe that cities today have become really good at working with both the environmental and the economic sustainability. Cities are prospering. They are very good at focusing on the green growth agenda. They're also becoming very smart. They're using technology to enable these changes. And for us, technology is an enabler. It's not the goal, but it's a means to reach the goal. But what about the social part? So the social part of sustainability, that's about the people. We need to focus on that too. We need to find out what actually matters to the people. And to do that, we have developed this new program. And I'd like to finish off by showing you a very short film that shows you what this program is all about.
Cities are growing. In just 12 years, 1 billion more people will be living in urban areas, an unprecedented increase that will put tremendous pressure on everything, from housing to infrastructure, welfare services, the environment, and the economy. We need to rethink our cities. We want cities where we all feel safe, healthy, free, content, and inspired. Yet, how do we measure these things? We can measure the environment and the economy in terms of numbers and spreadsheets, but the social aspect calls for something else. Our quality of life depends on the balance between the 3 pillars of sustainability. To ensure balance, we need to measure and evaluate all pillars on equal terms. Capturing the social dimension requires that we develop the right tools. If we don't, our cities will collapse, and ultimately, citizens will pay the price. The International Federation for Housing and Planning has decided to develop the missing tool for measuring social sustainability. We call it Social Cities and divide it into 3 steps. 1. A Social Cities tool that collects data on social indicators and translates them into an easy-to-read social diagnosis of the city. 2. An ideation lab where citizens, politicians, experts and corporations co-create solutions to cure the city of its diseases. 3. A global platform for knowledge sharing and networking to help develop best practices.